Breaking news, Pam Bondi walked into this hearing with one strategy: don't answer anything. It took Jasmine Crockett exactly 4 minutes and 7 seconds to make that strategy collapse live on camera. But it wasn't the questions that broke her. It was the folder, 43 pages, 38,000 references, and one notation on page 7 that Bondi had no explanation for. What she said next, instead of answering, is why this hearing ended the way it did. It had started like every other oversight hearing. Procedural, predictable, almost deliberately boring. Attorney General Pam Bondi entered room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building at 9:03 a.m., flanked by DOJ aides carrying colour-coded briefing binders. She looked comfortable, rehearsed, like someone who had done this exact performance 100 times and already knew how it ended. She had no idea what was sitting in the manila folder at Congresswoman Crockett's seat. But stay with this, because what Crockett found in that folder the night before didn't just change the hearing, it changed what accountability in this country looks like. But to understand what happened in that room, you have to go back 24 hours earlier to a late-night discovery that changed everything. It was 11:42 p.m. when Crockett's senior investigative counsel knocked on her office door. He dropped a printed document on her desk without a word. The document was a compiled breakdown of references to Donald Trump across reviewed Epstein files. 38,000 mentions, his name, his wife's name, Mar-a-Lago, and buried inside those references were investigative notes, FBI field notes, witness statements, and details that had been available to the Department of Justice for months. Details that Pam Bondi's DOJ had apparently decided required no further examination. What Crockett didn't know yet was that the most damaging part wasn't the number. It was what was written inside those files, and she wouldn't discover that until she reached page 7. Crockett didn't sleep that night. At 6:15 a.m., she was already in the hearing room. She sat alone at the long committee table, reading through the file one more time. She wasn't preparing a political attack, she was preparing a case. But then something shifted. Halfway through her third read, she stopped on a single paragraph. She read it again and again, because if what was written there was accurate, if those specific FBI field notes said what she thought they said, then Pam Bondi had not just failed to investigate, she had failed to explain why she hadn't. What none of the Republican members arriving that morning could see, what Bondi's entire communications team had no idea was coming, was that Crockett had already decided the hearing's outcome before a single camera turned on. Here is where it gets worse for Bondi, because she walked in smiling. Bondi arrived 90 minutes later, still radiating the calm confidence of someone protected by institutional armour. She greeted Republican committee members warmly, shook hands, made small talk, and smiled at the press gallery. Her staff arranged talking points on the table in a precise row. She was ready for the questions she expected. She was not ready for Jasmine Crockett. When Crockett's turn finally came nearly 3 hours into the hearing, the Congresswoman didn't stand up slowly, shuffle papers, or clear her throat. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and wasn't going to waste a single second of it. She looked directly at Bondi and said, "I'm not going to ask you questions today." She paused just long enough for the confusion to register on Bondi's face, because it had become clear that this witness had no intention of actually answering them. The room shifted. Crockett turned to her colleague. "I'm going to ask some basic questions of a different member." Instead, she looked back at Bondi with an expression that carried no hostility and somehow no warmth either, just the clean, cold focus of someone about to present evidence. "Right or wrong," she said, "raping children." Her colleague answered immediately. "Wrong." "Right or wrong, protecting men who rape children." "Wrong." "Thank you," Crockett said, "because I probably never would have gotten those answers from our witness today." She let the implications settle across the room like smoke. Then she opened the folder. What happened next made a 17-year congressional veteran sitting 3 seats away later describe it as the most uncomfortable 4 minutes I've witnessed in this building, and the most important part, it hadn't even started yet. Crockett's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She began reading, not summarising, not characterising, but reading directly from the investigative notes compiled across reviewed Epstein files. The number came first: 43 pages of FBI field documentation, more than 38,000 references to the current president of the United States, his wife, or his Palm Beach property. Bondi's pen stopped moving. Crockett continued. She described a specific notation, an account from a federal investigator documenting Ghislaine Maxwell presenting a young girl to Trump. She read the notation about Epstein transporting a victim to Mar-a-Lago. She read Epstein's alleged words verbatim. This is a good one, as he reportedly introduced the girl to the former host of The Apprentice. Bondi's communications director, sitting in the row behind her, leaned forward and whispered something urgent. Bondi gave the smallest possible shake of her head. Her hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, were now flat against the surface, pressing down hard. And then Crockett reached page 7. "I am not saying the president is a pedophile," she said, her voice carrying the deliberate clarity of someone choosing words with surgical precision. "What I am saying is that there is a significant amount of documented evidence in files controlled by your department, suggesting he maintained close relationships with men who are, and your department has done nothing with that evidence." That was the moment every reporter in the room realised Bondi had no answer for this. But what Bondi did next, instead of addressing a single page of those files, is what made this hearing impossible to forget. Bondi finally spoke. She pivoted immediately. Not to the files, not to the specific references, not to the investigative notes Crockett had just read into the Congressional record. She pivoted to undocumented immigrants. She began listing names, crimes committed in different states, convictions from Texas, from Georgia, from places entirely unrelated to anything in the folder in front of Crockett. And that pivot, more than anything else said in that room, is what shattered the composure Crockett had maintained for the last 4 minutes. "You're spending more taxpayer resources arresting journalists," Crockett said, her voice finally carrying an edge that cut through the practiced calm. "Then you are prosecuting pedophiles and creeps." She leaned slightly forward. "Your boss, the president, stated that this administration, and I'm quoting, took the freedom of speech away, and at your direction, the DOJ arrested Don Lemon and Georgia Fort." Bondi's jaw tightened visibly. A muscle moved near her temple. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "A judge rejected you," Crockett continued. "A grand jury rejected you in the Kelly case. Another grand jury rejected you in the Slacken case. The Tish James case was dismissed. The Comey case was dismissed." She paused for exactly 1 second. "This is exactly why people think you're incompetent," Crockett said, her voice finally snapping, "because you sit there and refuse to answer the simplest questions." The silence that followed lasted 8 full seconds. Reporters who had been typing stopped. Every camera in the room held on Bondi's face, on the slight flush along her jawline, on the way she blinked twice in rapid succession, on the almost imperceptible moment when her practiced composure cracked, and something raw flickered beneath it. Her aide passed her a note. She didn't look at it. She didn't address a single specific claim, not the 38,000 references, not the investigative notes, not the named individuals, not the dismissed cases. Instead, she looked at the Republican member beside her and said with a tone that was supposed to carry authority, and instead sounded like someone reaching for a lifeline, "You want to talk about what she wouldn't address? Hakeem Jeffries took money from Jeffrey Epstein after Epstein was convicted." Crockett didn't move, didn't flinch, and didn't look away. This is the part that no one in that room will forget, not the documents, not the numbers. What came next wasn't a dramatic breakdown. It was something worse, a complete inability to respond to documented evidence with anything except a change of subject. The Attorney General of the United States, faced with 38,000 file references and specific FBI investigative notes, had chosen to talk about a different politician's donor history. And that moment, that specific non-answer, is now in the permanent Congressional record. Nothing removes it. "Let me address the survivors," Crockett said, turning slightly toward the gallery where Epstein victims and their advocates had been sitting in silence through hours of testimony. "Because that is exactly what they are. They are not victims, they are survivors." Her voice, for the first time, carried something other than precision, something that sounded like genuine fury compressed into controlled syllables. Let me say thank you for having more courage and moral clarity in your pinky fingers than the entire Department of Justice has shown in this hearing room today." Crockett gathered her folder. She looked at Bondi one final time. "You will be remembered," she said quietly, "as one of the worst attorneys general in the history of this country. An attorney general who prioritised obstruction over justice, corruption over law, and loyalty to one man over loyalty to the Constitution." She yielded back her time. The room stayed silent for 3 full seconds after her microphone went dead. Within the hour, 38,000 references was trending. Within 2 hours, 3 former federal prosecutors called for an independent investigation. By evening, 2 senators demanded Bondi explain on the record why Crockett's notations had produced 0 investigative action. The word resignation appeared in 17 news segments before midnight. Bondi's office released one statement. It said the Attorney General remained committed to the rule of law. It did not mention the files. It did not mention a single dismissed case. Because Crockett hadn't come to that room to win an argument. She came to read the files out loud. And once those words were in the Congressional record, spoken into live microphones in front of every major outlet, nothing could put them back in the folder. Silence, when it is documented, becomes its own kind of evidence. Institutions that choose deflection over accountability don't get to decide when the questions stop. If what you watched today made you feel something, if those survivors in that gallery stayed with you for even a second, then you understand why this cannot disappear into the news cycle. The files are in the record, and so is everything Pam Bondi refused to address. The moment the microphones went dead, the room didn't immediately return to motion. It stayed suspended in that uneasy stillness, like everyone was waiting for someone to clarify what had just happened, or to rewind it back to something more familiar, but nothing about it rewound. Bondi remained seated, hands still on the table, eyes fixed somewhere between the folder that had just been closed and the space Crockett had occupied minutes earlier. For a brief moment, she didn't look like someone running a department. She looked like someone trying to decide whether the room itself had shifted against her. Crockett had already moved on. Not in a hurried way, not in triumph, but with the same controlled pace she had carried throughout the entire exchange. The folder was closed. The pages were back in order. The record had already been made. And that was the part that began to sink in for everyone else. Because congressional hearings are usually defined by what is said, argued, and contested in real time, this one had shifted into something different. It wasn't just debate anymore. It was documentation, statements entered into record, reactions preserved on camera, and silence that now carried as much weight as speech. A staffer behind Bondi leaned in again, whispering more urgently this time. She finally looked at the note. Her expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something tightened in her posture, like the room had become smaller than it was an hour earlier. Across the aisle, members began quietly speaking into their microphones, not for the record, but to their aides, asking for clarifications, transcripts, copies of exhibits. Phones were already lighting up, messages were being sent, calls were being placed before the hearing had even formally ended, and still no one fully moved to close it. Outside the chamber, the first wave of media reaction was already forming. Reporters who had been inside were repeating fragments of what they had heard, trying to reconstruct the sequence in real time, while those outside were still trying to understand why the tone had shifted so abruptly from procedural questioning to direct reading of investigative material. Within minutes, clips began circulating, short fragments stripped of context but heavy enough on their own to ignite immediate debate. Some focused on the references to the documents, others focused on Bondi's responses, others focused entirely on the silence between them. And as always, the interpretations split instantly. Some described what happened as accountability finally breaking through procedural language. Others described it as a politicized confrontation that raised more questions than it answered. Legal analysts began cautioning that raw references in hearings are not conclusions, and that allegations contained in documents are not findings of fact unless tested through proper judicial process. But none of those clarifications arrived fast enough to contain the momentum. Because what the public had actually witnessed wasn't just a line of questioning, it was a breakdown of expected structure. One side presenting a curated record, the other side refusing to engage directly with its contents, and a chamber forced to absorb the distance between those two positions in real time. By the time the hearing was formally adjourned, no one in the room looked satisfied. Not the members, not the staff, not the press. Even those who had entered expecting a routine oversight session were now gathering their things more slowly than usual, as if speed would somehow make the last hour less significant. In the hallway outside, the first official comments began to form. Some members called for further review of the documents referenced during testimony. Others defended the Attorney General's broader record and criticised the framing of the exchange. And a few refused to comment at all, walking past cameras without stopping. Inside the DOJ, the response was more controlled but no less immediate. Communications staff began drafting statements, not about the specifics of the hearing, but about process, standards, and the importance of context. The language was careful, designed to avoid engaging directly with the most viral fragments while still projecting institutional stability. But the problem with moments like this is that they don't remain contained within official responses. They spread through repetition. By evening, legal commentators, political analysts, and former prosecutors were all offering competing interpretations of what the hearing represented. some calling it an example of aggressive oversight, others warning about the dangers of presenting untested material as narrative certainty inside a political setting. And still, the footage kept circulating, not because it resolved anything, but because it didn't. The most discussed part wasn't a conclusion, it was the absence of one. No resolution to the claims raised, no clear rebuttal that matched the specificity of what had been read into the record, no procedural moment that reset the hearing back to neutrality, just an exchange that ended and then stayed ended. And in Washington, those are the moments that don't disappear. They linger in transcripts, they reappear in follow-up hearings, they get referenced in oversight letters, in press briefings, in interviews months later, when someone asks where the turning point was. Because long after the cameras stop rolling, the record remains exactly as it was entered. And once something is entered into that record in front of live microphones, it stops belonging to the room it happened in. It belongs to everything that comes after it.